When you're travelling somewhere new, or if you're out on the water, it's really useful to be able to quickly spot which way the currents are flowing. In this episode, I'm going to share my clues for spotting the current. So boats like this can be really helpful when you're spotting the currents because it's got quite a small propeller. You can see the propeller down there, quite a small engine, and when they're going against the currents, what they do is they hug the coast, so they come in really close because that's where the currents are weaker, and that means that they can use less fuel when they're getting where they want to. So if you're sitting on the beach and you see a fishing boat chugging really close to the shore, chances are they're going against the tidal currents. So one of the most obvious ways to spot the currents is to look at the water, but that can actually be a bit misleading because if you look out there now, you've got a bit of a swell coming this way with the wind and it looks like the water's going that way. But actually if you look a bit closer and a bit longer, you can see that there's actually a current coming along here, and that's also what's making the sea a little bit choppier. So this morning when I went swimming, the sea was really calm. That's because the wind and the currents were both going this way. But then when the currents turned and started going this way, the friction where the water and the wind collide with each other makes the sea a little bit choppy. So with that principle, if you look at the sea and it's choppy, then you know that maybe the wind and the currents are going the opposite way. So it's easy to see which way the wind's going, and that means you can work out which way the currents are flowing too. So if you know whether it's high or low tide, that really helps to work out which way the currents are going. So in our last video, we explained that at high tide, currents go the same direction as the tide wave, and at low tide, they're going the opposite way. So on this coastline, I know that the tide wave is travelling that way. So at high tide, anywhere on this coast, I know that at high tide, the water's got to be going this way. So the pier is a really good reference, because you can see how high up the water is on the legs. There's a platform at the very end there, and it's completely submerged at the moment. So that tells me it's high tide, and the currents must be going this way. So looking at a boat's anchor is really useful for seeing which way the currents are flowing, because the anchor is tied to the bow or the front of the boat. So when the currents flow, they pull the water evenly either side of the boat, so it's facing into the current. So this morning at 8 AM, this is which way the currents were flowing, so a boat would be facing that way. Whereas slack water is at 9 o'clock, and that means the currents turn around and they spin the boat around, so by 10 AM, the same boat would be facing the other direction. And if you see this happening when it spins around, you know that you've got 6 hours of currents flowing this way before they turn around and then go the other way again. Moving objects like this seaweed are really useful because it tells you the direction currents are flowing and the speed. All you need to do is time how long it takes to drift a certain distance, and you can calculate the speed. Luckily, I have my tape measure on this tide walk, and I measured the width of the pier as 7 meters. It took the seaweed 16 seconds to drift this distance, which means its speed was around 1.57 kilometers an hour. Structures like pier legs are perfect for spotting currents because the way water moves around them tells you which way the currents are flowing. So this phenomena happens on any stationary object, so it could be a post or a buoy, and the idea is the currents are coming in from this way, and when they hit the object you get this kind of bounce back on the upstream side where the currents hit the object, bounce back, and they wrap around at speed, and they wrap around on both sides, and that gives you this turbulence downstream of the object. So that's a really typical sign that the currents are going to the right here. And it happens on buoys as well, big or small. You get a little bit of a bow wave and then you get sort of rippling. And that's a really clear sign of which way the currents are flowing. Watching people in the water helps you quickly spot the current. If someone is swimming hard and staying in one place, or being pushed backwards, they'll be battling a powerful current. You can see here that Naomi is swimming into the current, which means they must have changed direction during our walk. This is reinforced by the driftwood drifting to the right, the opposite direction to where the seaweed was heading when we were at the pier. What was really interesting is that high tide today was at 11 o'clock and we were doing our walk around 12 and 1. So the currents should have been maximum flow to the north because it was high tide and my tide app told me it was flowing north, but actually they were much slower than they should have been, and then they turned much earlier. So when Naomi went in the water, she should have been pushed to the left when we were looking at it, but actually she was pushed to the right, and that's because the wind was going that way. So the wind almost counteracted the tidal currents. So that's why just looking at your app or your chart or just saying, well, it's 3 hours after high tide, the current's going to be going north, that's not enough. You've got to be able to look at all these different clues, because sometimes the weather can have a huge impact on what they're doing, and we're going to explore that in one of the later videos.